Hi, I'm Plabhash, and this is episode 1 of the video series called Stratum V2 Explained. Today we're gonna dive into the topic of mining. And first of all, I should make the acknowledgements that this video series is based on Gabriele Vernetti's Master Thesis on Politecnico Di Torino. I highly encourage you to check it out. This is Gabriele's GitHub, and you can find the PDF for his master thesis there. All of the content here is being taken from this PDF. I'm basically just reading it, trying to understand a little bit, and forwarding the knowledge, relaying the knowledge in a distilled way for you here. So we start this episode by diving into the concept of a hash function. We need to define what a hash function is. So basically, it is a mathematical function that takes an input of any size, which we call a pre-image, and it produces a number, which we'll call digest or simply hash. And this function needs to follow the following properties. It needs to be deterministic, meaning that every time you use the same input or the same pre-image, you get the same hash as the result. If you do it 1,000 times with the same input, with the same pre-image, you should get the same result 1,000 times. We also expect it to have a fixed sized output in terms of bits, right? So it's going to be a binary number, the hash, but the number of bits that we use to encode this number is always the same. We also have this property of pre-image resistance, which means that if you have a hash but you don't know the pre-image that generated this hash, there's no feasible way to guess the pre-image. The only option you have is to do a kind of brute force attack that would take you ages and ages to find the pre-image of this hash. So we call this property pre-image resistance. We also have the property of collision resistance, which means that every hash can only be generated by one single pre-image. We would never have a situation where two different pre-images generate the same hash. So these are the fundamental properties of a hash function. And although the hash is usually just a binary number, it is usually encoded as a string of characters for human readability. So we have this image here illustrating a hash function. So let's imagine that the pre-image is just the contents of a file, myfile.txt. We put that into a hashing algorithm or hashing function, and as a result we get a sequence of characters, right? This is actually a binary number, but it's encoded as a string of characters so that we as human beings can at least identify it as, hey, okay, this starts with a C, then there's a 3, a 2, a 3, and we can sort of recognize this hash. Bitcoin uses a hashing algorithm called SHA-256, which is defined under the FIPS-Pub 180-4 standard. And that is actually a standard defined by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is part of the US Department of Commerce. So they define a lot of industry standards, and SHA-256, it has been an industry standard for a while. It's a very secure hashing algorithm, and That's what Bitcoin uses. And so how does mining work? On a very high level, there are two main purposes for mining. First is to permanently add transactions to the blockchain without the permission of any central authority. For example, a central bank. Bitcoin is a permissionless protocol, so you don't have to ask for permission to anybody to transact. Mining enables this. Mining provides a mechanism for the permissionlessness of Bitcoin. And also, mining enables the fair distribution of the 21 million Bitcoin supply, and also the fee rewards that miners. So for the miners who spend real world resources to secure the network, and these real world resources are basically energy or electricity. So this is a very fundamental aspect of Bitcoin, is the fact that even though some people say that, yeah, Bitcoin has no pegging, its intrinsic value has no inherent basis, it is actually based on a lot of energy that comes from the physical world that is used to secure the network. So Bitcoin has this number called the difficulty target, and it represents the maximum value that a block header hash can be in order to be considered valid for the rest of the network. So miners need to find a block header, which in practice is the print image of a hash, that will generate a hash that satisfies the current difficulty target. This difficulty target is readjusted every 2016 blocks. And we're going to look into this in a little bit more detail soon. So let's look at what a block header is. Miners will build the so-called candidate block with all the best transactions that are received from the full nodes. These are usually the transactions with the higher fees, right? Because it's in the miner's best interest, since the miner is gonna recollect all these fees as an incentive, it's in the miner's interest to select the transactions that are paying the highest fees. And so the miner is gonna build a candidate block, and this candidate block is represented by a header. So here we have this image sort of giving a visual representation of a Bitcoin block, and the block, it consists of basically the header plus the transactions. So the transaction is just a list of transactions, and the header has a few different fields. The first field is just the hash from the previous block, and that's 32 bytes that points to the parent block, the last block that just happened on the blockchain. And this is actually what makes Bitcoin an actual blockchain, a chain of blocks, because every block on the header, you have one field that is pointing to the previous block, and we create the chain of blocks with this mechanism, and there's cryptographic proof that these blocks are linked to each other. Then we have three separate fields that together we call them the block metadata. The first field is the version, which is just 4 bytes indicating the version of the Bitcoin protocol that was used when the miner created this block. Then we have the timestamp, which are 4 bytes recording the Unix timestamp when this block was mined. Unix timestamps are also kind of an industry standard. They're just a number representing how many seconds have elapsed since January 1st, 1970. And we use this to sort of keep track of how time is progressing inside the blockchain. And then inside the metadata, we also have the difficulty target, which we just briefly mentioned on the previous slide. And that is basically 4 bytes representing the maximum allowed value for this block hash. And we're gonna dive into this in a little bit more detail soon. Then we have, the transactions, as you can see here, they're not part of the block header. They are kind of separate to the block header. But what you can do is to use some fancy cryptographic techniques and combine hashing functions in a way that you're gonna find one 32-byte hash that uniquely represents all the transactions that are contained on this block. So that's called the Merkle root, and it's representing inside the header in a very succinct, in a very small way. You don't have all the information from every single transaction here. That would take a lot of space, and we only have 80 bytes for the block header. So we use the Merkle root here, and that is a unique representation of all the transactions. Finally, we have the nonce, which is a 32-bit value that miners adjust or iterate, trying to find a valid block hash. So in a way, this is the solution for the proof of work puzzle. So let's look into this in a little bit more detail now. So if we remember, the mining process consists of taking this block header, calculating, using the block header as the pre-image of the SHA-256 hashing function, and we're gonna get a hash as the output. And then we're gonna compare, hey, does this hash, is it under the current difficulty target? Does it meet the requirements of the current difficulty target? And remember, the hash is just a number. So we're basically saying, hey, is this hash smaller than some specific threshold? And if it is not, then we just change the value of the nonce and we try again. And we just keep repeating this process until eventually we do find a nonce for which the pre-image of this block header will generate a hash that does meet the requirements of the difficulty target. And when that happens, that means we found a valid block. And basically now the next step is the miner adds this new mined block to its local copy of the blockchain and immediately broadcasts this block to all its peers. So this block propagates across the entire network, because basically the miner wants to do this as fast as possible, because the miner, when he found this valid block, he gets the right to claim these rewards, right? The Bitcoin that are created on this block, the subsidy and the fees that are collected from the transactions, they all go to the miner. So the miner wants to propagate, to broadcast this new find block as fast as possible. So yeah, block reward. We also call it subsidy. And so every block, there's new Bitcoin that are created as an incentive for the miners, plus transaction fees. Every account that is trying to move funds to another account needs to pay a transaction fee as an incentive for the miner to include that transaction inside the block. So these newly minted Bitcoin, and the transaction fees, they are contained and encoded in the so-called coin-based transaction. And differently from regular transactions in Bitcoin, this transaction does not use UTXOs as inputs, and instead it only has one single input known as the Coinbase, and it essentially generates new Bitcoin out of nothing, which is the subsidy plus the fees, and sends this Bitcoin to the miner's address. So now let's start looking into mining history and the evolution of mining. The first block was mined by Satoshi Nakamoto on January 3rd, 2009. And in the beginning, the network difficulty target was just 1. The total number of miners was very small, so the difficulty didn't really increase, and it was possible to mine blocks using an average personal computer. It was the only time in history when CPU mining was profitable. And as mining received more media attention, the mining difficulty started to rise. And maybe I should correct this. It was not necessarily profitable because Bitcoin wasn't really worth anything. There wasn't a very meaningful economic value for Bitcoin at that time. So maybe it wasn't really profitable, but it was doable, right? You would use your CPU and you would find blocks, and that's what the message that I'm trying to convey here. And then in 2010, people figured out that, hey, you have GPUs, right, which are graphic processing units. They're used usually for rendering graphics for gaming. And the thing about GPUs is that they're excellent at computing simple mathematical operations in parallel. So that allows for some optimization in mining. And that caused the global hash rate to increase. And as a consequence, the overall network difficulty target also increased. In 2011, people started looking into FPGAs, or field programmable gate arrays. And with FPGAs, you can create your own design with even more optimizations. So they were even faster than GPUs. So we got even more hash rate, and also the difficulty target also increased. In 2013, a Chinese company called Canaan Creative introduced the first set of application-specific integrated circuits, or ASICs, that were designed exclusively for Bitcoin mining. And in contrast to CPUs, GPUs, and FPGAs, ASIC devices were specifically built with the intention of Bitcoin mining. So those chips, they couldn't be used for anything else. They were only created for Bitcoin mining. And soon, other players like Bitmain and MicroBT also joined the game, introducing their own models of ASICs. And since then, there's been a big evolution in ASIC technology for Bitcoin mining. In 2013, it started at a size of 130 nanometers. But the latest hardware models go as small as 5 nanometers. That's all for transistor size. And the smaller the transistor, the more efficient the ASIC machine is at Bitcoin mining. So nowadays, an ASIC device is estimated to be 100 billion times more efficient than the average CPU back in 2009. So here's a visual representation of this history. First, there was Satoshi and a few other nerds mining Bitcoin on their CPUs, and their combined hash rate was so small that the mining difficulty was just flat 1 for a whole year. But then other people started to join the network, and then it started to increase. The difficulty started to increase, and people figured out GPUs. It increased even more. Then FPGAs. With FPGAs, there was a little bit of a stagnation in how the difficulty increased. That is probably due to the fact that FPGAs are kind of a general purpose device for prototyping electronic circuits, and they end up using a lot of energy. So FPGAs introduce this extra energy consumption into Bitcoin mining. But FPGAs are the first step towards ASICs, right? Because FPGAs enables the prototyping, and once the design is stable and efficient, then a hardware manufacturer can go and manufacture the ASICs from this design. And then when this started happening in 2013, there was yet another sharp spike in the mining difficulty, and ever since it's been a job of optimizing these ASIC designs, basically creating smaller and smaller transistors. And I mean, this is still bound to Moore's law, so there's a limit to how fast this optimization can go, but it's still happening, and we're getting more efficient devices with time. And here's a graph showing the efficiency of the Antminer S19 series. So the S19 is basically one of the most recent kind of state-of-the-art ASIC devices, and the efficiency is quantified in joules per hash. So if you take some specific amount of time, you're gonna look at how many hashes you were able to calculate in that interval, and you're gonna look at how much energy did you have to spend on this process. And the more hashes you get from the same amount of energy in the same amount of time, the more efficient your device is. So now let's start looking into what Bitcoin solo mining is, and then we'll look into what Bitcoin pooled mining is. So in solo mining, the miner relies solely on its own computational power to compete against the entire network in the race to find a valid block. The block reward is paid entirely to the solo miner, and the miner's address is put into the Coinbase output script. So let's try to model this with some formulas. If we say the difficulty target is D, then this value D is chosen so that every computed hash will lead to a valid block with a probability of 1 divided by 2 to the power of 32 multiplied by D. Basically this formula here. So if we have a miner with a hash rate H mining for a period of time T, this miner will calculate a total of HT hashes, and will find on average HT divided by 2 to the power of 32 multiplied by D blocks. And if the reward for each block is B, then this is the expected miner reward. Basically, I'm taking all these formulas from this source. I would encourage you to refer to it if you want to look into detail. It was a paper by Manny Rosenfeld from 2011, and we're going to look into these formulas with a little bit more detail. So let's look at an example here, a practical example with real numbers, right? So let's imagine Bob can perform 1 billion hash calculations per second. So Bob's hash rate is 1 gigahash per second, or 10 to the power of 9 hashes per second. Let's imagine Bob is mining continuously for an entire day. So that's 86,400 seconds. And let's imagine the difficulty target is 1.6 million. And the block reward is 50 Bitcoin. Then, on average, Bob will find 0.01 blocks in a day. And on average, Bob will get a payment of 0.595 Bitcoin on average for his day of work, right? So this is Bob's expected income for the work he's doing for the network in solo mining. So now we need to look at the problem of variance. Because solo mining can be modeled as a Poisson process. And a Poisson process is a field of probability and statistics that models events. And I'm not going to dive into too much detail about this statistics here, but basically this Poisson process can be modeled with a rate parameter that is age, the miner's hash rate, divided by 2 to the power of 32 multiplied by d. So mining for time t results in these many blocks being found on average, and the number of mined blocks follows a Poisson distribution with lambda, or the rate parameter, defined by this formula here. So this quantity is also the variance of the number of blocks found. So the variance for the payout follows this formula. I'm not going to read everything out loud because that becomes very boring, but yeah, you can see in the screen these formulas. And we also have a formula for the relative standard deviation, which is basically a fraction of the expected reward. And I mean, this is getting a little bit confusing, a lot of crazy formulas here, but let's bring this back to this example with Bob and do some calculations with this formula. So Bob has a variance of 29.75 Bitcoin squared in his payout. The standard deviation is 5.45 Bitcoin, which is almost 1000% of the expectation. In fact, the probability that Bob will receive any payment at all for his day of mining is about 1%. So let's meditate on this. Bob is mining the entire day. The probability that he will get any payment at all for his day of mining is around 1%. How can Bob build a sustainable business model? How can Bob calculate his return of investment, his ROI, or even make his mining activity rational and have it make any sense if there's a 1% chance of profit? So that is the problem of variance in solo mining. So as the global hash rate increased, mining transformed into an industrial activity. It's a business model that happens on an industrial scale. and miners have to consider many factors for this business activity, such as this prohibitive variance of finding valid blocks during solo mining. So the concept of pooled mining became a popular solution to this problem. So now we dive into what pooled mining is. Pools are systems where multiple miners combine their hashing power and share the resulting rewards. So a candidate block is built to pay the reward to the pool's Bitcoin address, and individual miners connect their mining equipment to the pool server. Each miner communicates a Bitcoin address to the pool, and that is used to receive their share of the rewards once a valid block is found. So the mining hardware remains connected to the pool server while mining, synchronizing their efforts with the other miners. The main business model of pool operators is typically just a percentage fee, which is cut off from the rewards that are collected by the miners. And one detail that I guess I forgot to mention, or no, I did mention, the candidate block is built to pay. The reward basically goes to the pool's Bitcoin address in the Coinbase transaction. If you remember the definition of the Coinbase transaction, instead of going to the miner's address, now in the pool, it goes to the pool's address. And then the pool is responsible for looking at how many hashes per second is each miner contributing. And when we have the rewards, how are we going to split these rewards? How much does each individual miner get? And how much does the pool get? So in order to make this accounting, we have the notion of shares, because the pool needs to account for the work done by each individual miner. And a share, the definition of a share is basically block header hashes that are mined under a lower difficulty target. So these hashes, they are valid under a lower difficulty target. They're still not valid for the entire Bitcoin network. They're not valid blocks under the eyes of the entire Bitcoin network, but they are valid blocks under a different difficulty target. So we have this visual representation here, which, I mean, we're making some analogies here just to explain the concept of shares in an easier way to understand. So let's imagine that finding hashes is the equivalent of rolling dice. And let's imagine that rolling dice can result in a number between 0 and 1,000, right? So each miner is going to be rolling dice, as many dice as they can in the same amount of time. And what the miners are trying to do ultimately is to find a dice roll that will result in a number that's smaller than 4, right? If the dice roll is smaller than 4, that means we found a valid block for the Bitcoin network. But we still want to prove that we're rolling a lot of dice in a specific amount of time. So we set a different difficulty target that is not 4, but now the difficulty target is 99. And we're gonna get a lot more dice rolls that meet this adjusted difficulty. And those are not valid Bitcoin blocks, but they are valid shares. And they are a way that a miner can prove that they are still doing a lot of work. They're calculating a lot of hashes per second. And when they're sending these shares to the pool is able to check, hey, yeah, this individual miner is doing this amount of work. And when we eventually find a block, this miner has earned the right to claim a slice of these rewards that are proportional to the hash rate that this miner is contributing. So when someone in the pool successfully mines a block, the reward is earned by the pool, and it's shared with all the miners in proportion to the number of shares they contributed to the effort. The first mining pool ever created was so-called a slush pool, now known as Brains, and it was born in 2010. Since then, the need for mining pool operations has greatly increased. And in order to manage all the communication between individual miners and mining pool servers, some kind of specialized communication protocol had to be developed. And that will be the topic for the next episode. We're gonna dive into the history of pooled mining protocols. We're gonna look into get work, then we're gonna look into get block template, and then we're gonna look into Stratum, which nowadays is more commonly known as Stratum V2. So yeah, this is the end of episode 1. I hope you enjoyed.